Number 5 spot, human remains. In 1967, Disneyland Imaginers used real human skeleton remains obtained from the UCLA Medical Center to make Disneyland's Pirates of the Caribbean ride look more convincing. How messed up is that? If you visited the park around this time and went on this ride, then the bones you saw were real. Over time, most of the bones have been removed, but employees have said that one still remains, and that is the skull that sits above the treasure room bed. So the next time you go on this ride, keep a lookout for that. Speaking of human remains, apparently the employees in charge of the Haunted Mansion ride at Disneyland have to constantly be on the lookout for people dumping ashes. Apparently it's not uncommon for people who have passed on to have asked their family members to dump some of their ashes there. Yeah, that's pretty eerie.
Coming in at number 4, Mulan. There's been a lot of excitement and criticism concerning the upcoming live-action Mulan film. A lot is changing from the original animated version, which has some fans a tad irked, so you could say. Regardless of how you feel about it, it's undeniable that it's a movie that will attract a large audience when it's released. But did you know that the story behind Mulan is actually much more tragic than what appears in the animated film? So Disney's version follows Mulan, a girl who is pals with a small dragon, and a cricket who ends up pretending to be a man in order to fight in the Chinese army facing off against the Huns. She wins the war and goes back home. Happy ending. But the Hua Mulan poem that it's based on, China loses the war. The Khan then encounters Mulan and tells her that he'll let her live if she lives with him. She plays along but eventually escapes, returning home, only to discover her beloved father is now dead and that her mum has remarried. She then kills herself to be with her father. That's some dark stuff.
Up next at 3, The Little Mermaid. The Little Mermaid tells the tale of Ariel, the daughter of the King of the Sea, who just wants to walk where the people walk. After falling in love with Prince Eric, she strikes up a deal with Ursula, and after a hefty amount of conflict, she does end up living happily ever after. Now, Hans Christian Andersen chose a different fate for Ariel in his version of the story. In Ariel's deal in this tale, part of the agreement is that her legs will hurt all the time, which feels as if she's walking on knives. Because of her constant pain, things don't go as she hoped, and the prince ends up falling in love with another lady. Ariel, utterly heartbroken, throws herself into the sea and transforms into sea foam, which doesn't seem like it's a pleasant fate. Bunch of foam in the water. Nah, that's not how a love story goes.
Swinging in now at number 2, Cinderella. The Disney Cinderella film was released in 1950, but the Cinderella story is actually much older than that. There is actually a whole history of variations of the story throughout the centuries, with over 500 from Europe alone. The one with the most similarities to the Disney one though originated in the 17th century in Italy. 60 years later, that story was retold in a French tale, and then after that the Brothers Grimm retold it yet again in the 19th century. In this one, rather than glass, Cinderella's slippers are made of gold. When the prince comes round to test out women's feet to see who the slippers fit, Cindy's stepmom orders her stepsisters to cut off their toes so that their feet will slide into the slipper seamlessly. Wow. That plan doesn't work though, and when Cinderella marries the prince, the stepsisters are forced to attend the wedding, where they are further mutilated by pigeons who pick out their eyes. Wow.
And finally, in our number 1 spot, Snow White. The Brothers Grimm have told many a grim tale, puns, including Snow White. And just like Cinderella, Snow White has been retold countless times, including in an animated short by the Fleischer Brothers starring Betty Boop, in which the whole tale acts as a metaphor for female empowerment. And cocaine. Can't forget the drugs. It was the early 30s, people. Anywho, the Brothers Grimm tale has a few stark differences, one being that the evil queen is a whole lot more evil. She regularly feasts on the innards of women who are fair, so that she can be fair. Guts that the huntsman actually collects for her. Now when Snow White is rescued by the prince, she's actually still unconscious, and when he takes her back home with him, with her being unconscious, it's only because her casing hits a rock that she's jolted awake. But I guess she's like, okay cool, I'll hang out with this prince, because the two then get married, and the evil queen is forced to dance in hot iron shoes at their wedding, until she dies of exhaustion. Not really the kind of entertainment that you'd want at your wedding though, is it?
Coming in at number 5, Cinderella. Cinderella is a movie from the 1950s that we all grew up watching and loving. Its story followed Cinderella, a woman who has a dream of attending the royal ball so she can meet the Grand Duke. However, her dream is hindered by her evil stepmother. But luckily for Cinderella, she gets her own help from her fairy godmother. However, in the Brothers Grimm version of the story, Cinderella takes on a much darker tone, and I mean much darker. In the section of the story where the evil stepsisters try on shoes to prove to the prince that they should marry them, one of the sisters cuts off her toes, and the other her her heel so that they can both fit into the tiny glass slipper. The prince is then notified by doves that there is blood on the shoe and ultimately discovers that the true owner is Cinderella. So sweet. So once the stepsisters realize that they should try to win over Cinderella, they attend the wedding, only to have their eyes pecked out by birds. Disturbing, right? Well, it doesn't end there. In the story, Cinderella doesn't have a fairy godmother. Rather, she plants a tree by the grave of her mother and prays under it every single day. She then finds her dresses to wear to each ball under the tree. She is still helped by animals, specifically birds. Also, she doesn't lose her shoe because she is in a rush, but instead the prince covers the step in black tar to make her stick to them, but she only loses the one shoe in the process. The entire thing is screwed up. I know, princes suck.
Coming out at number 4, deaths. So one of the most popular rides at Disneyland is the Matterhorn. Well, it turns out there have actually been 2 deaths caused by this ride. In 1964, a 15-year-old boy from Long Beach was injured after he stood up on the Matterhorn bobsled and fell out. He died 3 days later as a result of the injuries. Then in 1984, a 48-year-old woman was killed when she was thrown from a Matterhorn bobsled car and struck by the next oncoming bobsled. So the next time you go on it, if you choose to go on this ride again after hearing these stories, make sure you're extra careful. Coming in at number 3, sexist. Nowadays, Walt Disney is all about gender equality, but it didn't always used to be that way. Back in 1938, a woman named Mary T. Ford applied to Walt Disney Productions for a job as an animator. Shortly after she applied, she received a rejection letter. She was informed that she wasn't the right person for the position because she was a woman. The really ironic part is that the rejection letter was written on Snow White stationery that was decorated with 2 female characters. In the rejection letter, they actually wrote the following: "Women do not do any of the creative work in connection with preparing the cartoons for the screen, as that task is performed entirely by young men. For this reason, girls are not considered for that training school. The only work open to women consists of tracing the characters on clear celluloid sheets with India ink, and then filling in the tracings on the reverse side with paint according to directions." What's even crazier is that this letter that was given to her was signed by Mary Clean. Yes, this letter was signed by another woman. Also, there's no reasoning behind why they don't hire women for this position. Ridiculous. Also, I'm going to throw in a fun little fact for you guys about Snow White. So the voice behind Snow White was from Adrena Case Lottie, and she only got paid $970 total for her performance of the voice of Snow White. Also, after the movie's release, she was unable to find acting work because her voice became so recognizable. So yeah, having such an iconic role as voicing Disney's first princess backfired. Coming in at number 2, racism. There's actually so much racism in Disney movies, it's ridiculous. First, we have Fantasia, which was released in 1940. The original release of this movie included a now controversial character named Sunflower. She was a small dark-skinned centaur with braided hair who was a servant to the larger light-skinned centaurs. She was in charge of polishing their hooves and doing their hair. These scenes were viewed as extremely inappropriate, so Disney removed her from the film in 1969, which was 29 years after its release. Then the very next year in 1941, we have Dumbo. While this movie is about a little elephant, the story does have some deep racist undertones when it comes to the crows. The leader of the South African speaking crows is named Jim Crow, which was also the name of the laws that brought segregation to the South in the late 1800s and continued until 1965. The crows are also portrayed as dim-witted, annoying, and lazy. Then in 1946, we got hit with maybe the most racist and inappropriate film of them all, The Song of the South. This was just blatantly racist. This movie is about a former black slave singing songs and telling stories while still living on the plantation he was enslaved in. I don't know what Disney was thinking with this one. Over the years, critics have referred to this movie as one of Hollywood's most offensive and racist texts. It's also been called out for basically glorifying slavery. This video has never been officially released in its entirety on home video in the US, and now you know why. But before all of the negative attention took over, this movie did manage to win an award for Best Song. And that song was Zippity Doo Dah, which I'm sure many of you have heard before. After this, we have racism in Peter Pan with the Native Americans, The Lady and the Tramp with the Siamese cats, and The Jungle Book with the monkeys. Yeah. It's a lot.
Starting us off at number 5, Beauty and the Beast. Beauty and the Beast is one of Disney's tales that was recently retold via a live-action adaptation. While it had its differences, much of the story still sung the same tune. But the original story that it's based off of isn't as joyful. Written by Gabrielle Suzanne Barbat de Villeneuve, Belle, after being taken in by the Beast, convinces him to let her visit her sisters for a week. The sisters, who now have a luxurious lifestyle, sway Belle into staying with them a little bit longer. Of course, this doesn't bode well with the Beast. He goes mad, hunts her down, and then devours her. So yeah, not quite the love story that we all know the Disney classic to be. I think I'll pass on that.
Coming in at number 4, Pinocchio. Yet another Disney classic we all grew up loving and watching. Pinocchio was released in 1940 and followed a marionette who must earn the right to become human by proving his truthfulness, bravery, and unselfishness. A cricket, Jiminy, constantly assists him as his conscience along the way. The movie is based on a story that appeared as a serial in a newspaper called The Adventures of Pinocchio, written in 1881 and 1882 by Carlo Collodi. In the story, Jiminy Cricket appears as the talking cricket in the book and does not play as prominent of a role. He actually first appears in chapter 4. I quote, "At these last words, Pinocchio jumped up in a fury, took a hammer from the bench and threw it with all his strength at the talking cricket. Perhaps he did not think he would strike it, but sad to relate, my dear children, he did hit the cricket straight on the head. With a last weak crick, the poor cricket fell from the wall dead." However, don't fret too much, Pinocchio eventually learned his lesson, or seemed to. While he didn't feel bad about killing the cricket, he did seem to regret not taking the cricket's advice, as he runs into more and more trouble along the way. Pinocchio is constantly tortured in different ways throughout the story, all punishment for bad behaviour. Collodi initially ended the story with Pinocchio's death by hanging, but because of the outcry from fans, Collodi was forced to continue, so instead he spared his life in exchange for even more gruesome punishments from that point on. I mean, that's what you get for killing Jiminy Cricket. Coming in at number 3, Snow White. Let's keep going with these classics, shall we? Released in 1937, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Snow White, a princess, is exiled by her stepmother, an evil queen who wants to kill her. So she runs into a forest and is eventually rescued by 7 dwarfs who form a friendship with her. However, it turns out Walt Disney left out some rather gruesome details in the animated movie. The movie is of course based on the original story by German brothers Grimm, and the story is a lot more grim indeed. Despite the book's title, it was actually never intended for children, with the original text including violence, incest, and lots of sex. Now in the original text, which was actually called Little Snow White, the evil queen asks a hunter to take Snow White into the forest to kill her. However, in the original version, she was just 7 years old at the time. In the Grimm version, the queen orders the huntsman to bring back Snow White's internal organs, saying, "Kill her, and as proof that she is dead, bring her lungs and liver back to me." So instead he kills a boar and brings back to the queen the boar's lungs and liver, which the queen thinks belongs to Snow White and then eats them. I quote, "The cook had to boil them with salt and the wicked woman ate them, supposing that she had eaten Snow White's lungs and liver." Now to make matters worse, Snow White is also already dead by the time the prince finds her, but he falls in love with her anyways, and as he carts her coffin away to do God knows what with it, the piece of poisonous apple falls out of her throat and she awakens, and as a punishment for her deeds, the evil queen is forced to wear a pair of glowing hot iron shoes placed before her with tongs and dance in them until she drops dead. Lovely stuff. Coming in at number 2, The Little Mermaid. Released in 1989, The Little Mermaid tells the story of Ariel, a young princess who makes a deal with the sea witch, allowing her to meet Eric, the human prince she loves. However, in the original version by Hans Christian Andersen, things aren't quite as cheery. Though the deal with the sea witch does still occur, the penalty for failure isn't just turning back into a mermaid. Instead, it's death. Isn't it always? Yeah, not so kid friendly now, is it? Every step Ariel takes makes her feel like she's walking on daggers, but she still dances for the prince and soon becomes his companion. However, there is no happily ever after because the prince ends up marrying another girl who he mistakenly believes was the one to save him from the shipwreck. Before the mermaid faces death, her sisters sell their hair to bring her a dagger. If she kills the prince, his dripping blood will cause her feet to become fins again. However, in the end she can't do it, and so she jumps off the ship where the wedding was held and ends up turning into sea foam. Disturbing as hell, I know. And finally, coming in at number 1, Sleeping Beauty. We all know the story of Sleeping Beauty. A young princess is cursed to sleep until her true love wakes her with a kiss. Now the Disney movie itself is pretty dark. There are spindles and even an evil witch who can turn into a dragon. However, the original story is very different and far more horrific. The original story was written by an Italian author named Giambattista Basile, who published a book called The Tale of Tales in 1634. It contained 50 different stories, including an early version of Rapunzel, Cinderella, Snow White, as well as Sleeping Beauty, which was actually called Sun, Moon and Talia. Now, as we know, in the Disney version, Princess Aurora is swept off her feet by the prince. However, in the original story, the princess is not swept off her feet, she's actually in her sleep. The two main characters don't even meet until Sleeping Beauty is already asleep. Crazy, I know. In the original version, a king finds an abandoned palace. He then sneaks through the window using a ladder and searches every room until he finds Sleeping Beauty, named Talia, who was lying on a bed, deeply sleeping. I quote, "Crying aloud, the king beheld her charms and felt his blood course hotly through his veins. He lifted her in his arms and carried her to bed, where he gathered the first fruits of love," aka Hold on though, it gets worse. After he does this, the king goes home and thought nothing of it. Sleeping Beauty wakes up when the fairies place the twins on the sleeping woman's breast so they can nurse. Yeah, she gave birth to the king's twins while she was asleep. Now in the Disney version, Maleficent is the self-proclaimed mistress of evil and curses baby Aurora with the threat of a spindle. However, in the original story, she is the king's wife, a woman married to a cheating rapist. And after she finds out he cheated, she turns vicious and threatens a secretary to reveal the secret of the king's mistress, warning him, "If you hide the truth from me, you will never be found again, dead or alive." He of course tells the queen everything, and in turn the queen tricks Sleeping Beauty into sending her children to the queen. And this is where gets really dark. The queen then orders the cook to slaughter the children and cook them up in several tasty dishes for her wretched husband. The cook couldn't go through with it though, so she instead hides the twins and cooks lamb in their place. Let's skip over the end. The queen is eventually thrown into a fire by the king, and the king and Sleeping Beauty are finally reunited with no harm to their children. They get married and live happily ever after. Dumb.